He called it a performance review. That was the word he used when he sent the calendar invite. Performance review, neutral. Administrative, the kind of language that gives nothing away until you're already in the room. The meeting was scheduled for 9 a.m. on a Tuesday. He had booked the large conference room, not the small one by the kitchen where actual performance reviews happened, but the glass-walled room in the center of the floor that every person in the office could see directly into. I noticed that when I got the invite. I noticed the room. I noticed the time. I noticed that he had copied HR, his deputy, and 3 senior managers I had never once been included on a meeting with. I noticed all of it. And I said nothing. Because by 9 a.m. on that Tuesday, I had already been the majority owner of the company that held his employment contract for exactly 31 days. Before I tell you what I said when he finished, and why the HR director's face went a color I don't have a name for, drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from. This story travels further than I expected. My name is Claire. I'm 33 years old. To my colleagues at Vertex Meridian Group, I was the Director of Strategic Operations, a title that sounded significant and was treated as decorative. I had held it for 4 years. I had rebuilt the operational infrastructure of a division that was hemorrhaging money when I arrived and was generating a 22% margin when I left. I had done this without fanfare, without a budget increase, and without once being invited to the quarterly leadership meetings where my work was discussed, credited to others, and applauded. To the 6-person board of Arcturus Holdings, the private equity parent company that quietly owned Vertex Meridian Group through 2 layers of subsidiary structure. I was, as of 31 days prior, the majority stakeholder and acting chair. My boss, a man named Richard Calloway, did not know this. Richard knew many things. He knew the best table at every expense account restaurant within walking distance of our office. He knew which senior partners played golf and which ones preferred tennis. He knew how to walk into a room and immediately identify the most important person in it and position himself beside them within 4 minutes. What Richard did not know was how to read a shareholder registry. What Richard had never done was open the quarterly filings that crossed his desk and actually read them. What Richard had spent 4 years doing was taking the work I produced, presenting it in rooms I was not invited to, and calling it collaborative. I had watched this for 4 years. I had documented it for 2. To understand what happened in that conference room, you have to understand what the previous 4 years had looked like from my side of the glass. I joined Vertex Meridian as a senior analyst in 2020. The company was mid-size, regional, the kind of firm that had been successful enough for long enough that it had stopped asking whether it was still doing things correctly. 3 of its largest operational contracts were structured in ways that were actively losing money. Nobody had noticed because the losses were distributed across divisions in a way that made them invisible at the top line. I noticed within my first 6 weeks. I wrote a 34-page operational audit and submitted it to Richard. He read 2 pages, told me it was interesting, and scheduled a meeting with the executive team where he presented a 4-slide summary of my findings as his own quarterly insight. I sat in that meeting. I watched him present my work. I watched the executives nod. I watched one of them say, "Richard, this is exactly the kind of strategic thinking we need more of." Richard thanked him. He did not say my name once. I drove home that evening, and I sat in my kitchen, and I made a decision that I want to be honest about. I did not decide to get revenge. I decided to get educated. I enrolled in a corporate finance course. I started reading every SEC filing, every shareholder disclosure, every board communication I could find for companies in our sector. I started understanding not just how businesses operated, but how they were owned, who held the actual levers, where the real decisions were made, and why the person with the title was so often not the person with the power. Over the next 2 years, I rebuilt the operational systems of Vertex Meridian's largest division so completely that it became the firm's most profitable unit. I was given a performance bonus that was 40% lower than the bonus given to the division head, who had opposed every change I made. I was passed over for promotion twice. The second time, Richard told me I was not yet ready for leadership profile. He said it with genuine warmth, the warmth of a man who has never once considered that the person across from him might be keeping score. I was keeping score. I was keeping everything. 14 months ago, I learned that Arcturus Holdings, the private equity firm that owned Vertex Meridian through a subsidiary chain, was in a quiet restructuring. 3 of their portfolio companies had underperformed. 2 of their founding partners had exited. The remaining board was looking to consolidate governance and bring in new capital. The information was not secret. It was in the filings, in the industry newsletters, in the quarterly communications that Richard forwarded to his assistant to summarize into 3 bullet points so he didn't have to read them. I read the full filings. I had been building a financial position for 2 years. Not dramatically, I was not wealthy in any obvious way. But I had been disciplined, systematic, and very patient. I had invested early in 2 tech-adjacent companies that had been acquired at significant multiples. I had a real estate asset I had purchased in 2021 that had appreciated considerably. I had a financial advisor named Thomas, who had, over 18 months of careful conversations, come to understand exactly what I was building toward. When Arcturus began its quiet restructuring, Thomas made introductions. I made calls. I sat in 3 meetings over 6 weeks with board members who were tired, who wanted resolution, and who were looking for someone with operational credibility and long-term vision. I had spent 4 years building the most profitable division of one of their portfolio companies. I had more operational credibility than anyone else in the room. The acquisition closed on a Monday morning. I signed the final documents in Thomas's office at 8:47 a.m. I was the majority stakeholder and acting chair of Arcturus Holdings, which meant I now owned, through the subsidiary structure, the parent company of Vertex Meridian Group. Which meant I owned Richard's contract. Which meant I owned the glass-walled conference room he had booked for my performance review. I went to work that day as normal. I answered emails. I attended a 2:00 p.m. call about Q3 logistics. I did not tell anyone. 31 days later, Richard sent the calendar invite. I want to be honest about the 31 days between the acquisition and the Tuesday meeting. I had not engineered the firing. I had not leaked anything to Richard or manipulated him into scheduling it. What I had done was complete a full operational and governance review of Arcturus's portfolio companies, which was my responsibility as the incoming chair. During that review, I had documented, among other things, a pattern of expense misattribution in Vertex Meridian's leadership division. Golf trips filed as client entertainment. A vendor relationship that appeared to benefit a company in which Richard held a personal interest. 3 years of performance bonuses paid to division heads for work that, when traced to its origin, had been produced by analysts and directors who were not named in the bonus justifications. My name appeared in none of the bonus justifications. My work appeared in all of them. I had submitted the documentation to the Arcturus Board Counsel, a woman named Patricia, who was precise, experienced, and deeply unimpressed by what she read. She had advised me on the correct procedural path forward. We had agreed on a timeline. What I had not anticipated was that Richard would accelerate that timeline himself. When I received the meeting invite, I forwarded it to Patricia with a single line. He scheduled it for Tuesday. She replied within 4 minutes, "I'll be in the building." I arrived at the conference room at 8:58 a.m. Richard was already inside. So was the HR director, a woman named Sandra who had the careful neutral expression of someone who had been briefed and was managing her own discomfort. 2 senior managers sat along the wall. The glass walls of the room meant that at least 15 people on the open floor could see directly in. Richard had chosen this room deliberately. I understood that. He wanted an audience. He wanted the optics of authority, the large table, the HR presence, the managers as witnesses to his decisiveness. He wanted the office to see him managing a situation. He gestured to the chair across from him. I sat down. He opened a folder. He had printed documents, which I found almost charming in its formality. He said he wanted to begin by acknowledging my contributions to the firm. He used the word contributions the way people use it when they are about to explain why those contributions were insufficient. He said the firm had conducted a comprehensive performance evaluation. He said my role had been reviewed against the current strategic direction of the company. He said the leadership team had determined that my position was being eliminated, effective immediately, as part of a restructuring of the operations division. He said restructuring. He said strategic realignment. He said this decision was not a reflection of my character. He did not say my name once during that entire opening. Sandra slid a separation agreement across the table. 4 pages, a severance offer, a non-disclosure clause, a line at the bottom for my signature. The office outside the glass walls was very still. People were not pretending not to watch. They had stopped pretending. Richard folded his hands on the table and looked at me with the expression of a man who has rehearsed this and is now performing it with the specific confidence of someone who believes they are in complete control of what happens next. He asked if I had any questions. I said just one. I reached into my bag and placed a single document on the table. It was the Arcturus Holdings governance summary. 2 pages. My name on the cover as majority stakeholder and acting chair. A subsidiary chain on page 2, clearly annotated, ending with Vertex Meridian Group LLC. I slid it across the table to Richard. He looked at it. He picked it up. I watched him read the first page. I watched him turn to the second page. I watched him find Vertex Meridian Group in the subsidiary list. I watched his eyes move back to my name at the top of the first page. He set it down. The room was very quiet. This is, he started. Accurate, I said. As of 31 days ago. Sandra reached forward and picked up the document. She read it with the focused attention of someone whose professional calculus had just changed completely. The door opened. Patricia walked in. She was 58 years old. She had been practicing corporate law for 30 years, and she walked into rooms the way people walk in when they have never once had to announce their own authority. She set her own folder on the table. She introduced herself to Sandra by name. They knew each other, which I had expected, and she said she was here on behalf of the Arcturus Holdings Board in her capacity as board counsel. She said there were several procedural matters that needed to be addressed before any employment actions were finalized at the Vertex Meridian level. Richard said, "I don't understand what's happening." Patricia looked at him with the patient expression of a woman who has explained complicated things to unprepared people many times before. She said, "You've initiated a termination proceeding against the majority owner of your parent company." She let that sit for exactly 3 seconds. That creates some complications. What happened next was not loud. That is the thing I want to be clear about. There was no shouting. There was no dramatic confrontation. Patricia opened her folder and walked Richard and Sandra through the documentation with the calm efficiency of someone administering a very organized correction. The expense misattribution. The vendor relationship. The bonus justifications. 3 years of work traced to its origin, documented, and presented in a sequence that left no interpretive room. Richard's attorney, who had been called and arrived 18 minutes into the meeting, slightly out of breath, asked for a recess twice. Patricia granted both. Richard and his attorney stepped into the hallway. The senior managers along the wall had stopped being witnesses to Richard's authority and had become witnesses to something else entirely. During the second recess, one of them, a man named David who had been at the firm for 11 years and who had once, at company retreat, quietly told me that he knew the bonus situation was wrong, looked at me across the table and gave me a small nod. Just a nod. Nothing performative. I nodded back. When Richard came back in the final time, his attorney did the talking. The terms was straightforward. Richard's contract would be transitioned. A separation would be mutual and documented as such. There would be a governance review of the division. The board, my board, would oversee the operational transition. Richard signed. He did not look at me when he signed. He stood up, buttoned his jacket out of muscle memory, and walked out of the conference room through the open floor where 15 people watched him go. The glass walls worked both ways. They always had. I stayed in the conference room for another 2 hours with Patricia and Sandra, working through the transition documentation. At some point, someone brought coffee. I don't remember who. I drank it while reviewing governance structures, and I thought about the 34-page audit I had written in my first 6 weeks, the one Richard had summarized into 4 slides and presented as his own strategic insight. I thought about the evening I had driven home after that meeting and sat in my kitchen and decided to get educated instead of angry. I thought about Thomas, my financial advisor, who had told me 18 months into our conversations that most people in my position spend their energy trying to be seen by the people who are determined not to look. He had said, you can spend a decade trying to get credit from someone who has decided not to give it. Or you can spend that time building something they eventually have to reckon with. I had chosen the second thing. After Patricia left, Sandra asked to speak with me alone. She closed the conference room door. She said she wanted me to know that she had raised concerns internally about the bonus discrepancies 2 years ago. She said she had been told it was a leadership matter and outside her scope. I told her I appreciated her telling me. She asked what my plans were for the division. I told her I intended to promote from within. I told her I had a clear picture of who had actually been doing the work. She nodded. She understood what I meant. I drove home that evening on roads I had driven for 4 years. The city looked the same. My phone had messages from colleagues, careful, cautious messages, the kind people send when they are trying to understand which way the wind is blowing before they commit to a direction. I put it face down on the passenger seat. I thought about the calendar invite. Performance review. The glass-walled room. The audience Richard had assembled to watch him make me small. He had chosen the room. He had chosen the time. He had assembled the witnesses. I had just shown up with the right paperwork. That night I made dinner and reviewed the Q4 operational projections for 3 of the Arcturus portfolio companies and went to bed at a reasonable hour. In the morning, I had a board to chair. I had always had a board to chair. Now it was just official.